So have you seen the new show, The Studio?
I have.
What does it get right about running a studio?
Well, Oscar Wilde said that every jest is a truth in the womb of time. So in each one of those episodes, there is a kernel of brilliant, blinding truth. And that's what makes great satire, and I think the show is wonderfully satiric. Besides that kernel, everything else is horseshit. Okay? I mean, you know, we were actually, maybe some days, but most days, we're not morons. But I take it with the sense of humor that it's intended, which was good for a laugh there. Well, what it gets right is there's a fundamental truth in each episode of studio executives trying to do the right thing, and there being many, many obstacles to doing the right thing. The difference there is it depicts a great deal of moral compromise in pursuing that, and that's not really the way it is. Most people are people like me, love movies, have a lot of integrity, and just trying to do the best we can. Getting Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the way it worked was you went to his wonderful, very dear friend of mine and one of the great agents in the world, Mike Simpson's office at William Morris. And I'm a slow reader, and I went there and in a conference room with a little bottle of water, and the script was plopped down in front of you. And I read as the sun set, because I'm slow, and it was long, and it was fabulous. It just leapt up off the page. It was like the page was here and the letters were here. That's how alive it was. But I remember thinking to myself, well, you could have just come from Mars and just put me in the thing and asked me to read any one scene of that. And I would have told you, well, it's only Quentin Tarantino who writes like that. Only.
You also gave that really unique deal to Quentin Tarantino.
Yes.
For Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where the characters revert back over
Well, Quentin's
time,
deal,
right?
I can't take any credit or blame. Quentin was at Miramax for all, he counts them as 8, but it's really 9, depending on how you count Kill Bill twice, films at Miramax. And from Pulp Fiction on, that was his deal. That was the way it worked. And interestingly, that was the same deal that I had made, you know, when I represented Jim Jarmusch, and it was a common deal in the indie world. And this company had been part of Django on that deal, so we honored a historical deal. But he's absolutely sui generis and one of a kind in that he creates his own characters entirely. It's like Jim Cameron. There are very few true writer-directors who are making original characters. His original characters happen to be indelible. The story is a fun story for maybe for your Letterboxd folks, which was way back when Pulp Fiction, when I was on the Sundance, had a lab, and when I was younger, I was on the Sundance board for many years, but I was served as a reader for the lab. And so I was aware of Reservoir Dogs when it was in the lab from the beginning. So I knew who this dude was. And when I was at Goldwyn, it was my first real hard lesson in, if you want to compete, you better compete hard. We ended up as the number 2 bidder on Pulp Fiction. Harvey won the bidding, we were next. Well, it took me 20-some years, but I vowed, if I ever got the chance again, I wasn't coming second with that guy. And fortunately I didn't, and we were fortunate enough here to have Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which certainly would go. Quentin says, I've heard him say it's his favorite film, and it's very clearly one of my most favorite films and most treasured experiences I ever had.
Once Quentin makes his 10th film, how much time needs to pass until you ask him to make an 11th?
It already passed. What's less than a fraction of a second? That's how long, because I already had. And many times I've said, cut it out. Knock it off. Come on. No. But I'm going to tell you, I got nowhere. He's dead fucking serious. He's dead earnest. But the answer to your question is, it will be less than a minute after we make his next, that we try to get him to make it 11th because there aren't many people in the world who have so much joy to spread, right? And who can do it.
On the topic of that risk-taking, I mean, I have to ask about Wild at Heart, David Lynch.
Yes. That is a fax to me from David Lynch, sent about 2 weeks maybe before the Cannes Film Festival, where Wild at Heart was in the Cannes Film Festival and it didn't look like David was gonna finish in time. And I'm like, David, I'm worried you're not gonna finish. They're not moving the dates. It's whatever date it is. Like, please, just I can finish. And not only did he finish, but Wild at Heart, amidst great, wonderful, marvelous controversy, Wild at Heart won the Palme d'Or. And that was the third, in my time at Goldwyn, that was the third Palme d'Or we won. We won the Palme d'Or for a beautiful Swedish film called Best Intentions. We won it because we had the international rights on Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and we won it for Wild at Heart, which is just a wild, wonderful David Lynchian masterpiece. The guy who gave me my big break in life was Jim Jarmusch, who is the true patron saint of indie film, and without Jim's belief in me and giving me the opportunity, I certainly would never have had the chance to realize my dream. So my indie history goes way back when I was running the Samuel Goldwyn Company. And that was when true indies were indies. That was before Miramax had sold to Disney and when independent film was just starting to push into the mainstream. So Sam Goldwyn, whose name that was the son of Sam Goldwyn, of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The famous Sam Goldwyn. And Sam's son, for whom I worked and ran that company, had the best taste of any man I ever knew. He was born with exquisite taste. And he was also born with guts because he wouldn't expect this. His father was conservative, he came from a very conservative upbringing. You wouldn't have expected the level of risk-taking, but he was a risk-taker. But when we went to release Longtime Companion, here's what happened. There had been gay films that had played in New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles maybe, but there had never been a gay film, certainly not a film where the central narrative device was a death by AIDS, that had played nationwide. That was, right? That was like, back then, like living in the era we're living in now, where any thought of inclusivity was verboten. So what happened was, we took the film. I knew the film was great. Bruce Davison, fantastic, nominated for Academy Award, should have won. Deeply moving, wonderful film. And it had that thing, which is, you got the general from the specific. It was a love story between two guys, but it didn't matter if you were gay or straight. If you had a heart, you felt something, right? So it must have been at least 10, 15 years before Brokeback Mountain. That's how pioneering it was. And exhibition wouldn't book it. They wouldn't play it in the multiplexes. I picked up the phone and I called the head of each major circuit that we wanted to book. And I said the following: "Hi, I'm Tom Rothman. I'm the head of production at Goldwyn, and we're trying to get Longtime Companion to play in your theater, and I understand that you don't want to book it." And the guy would say, "Yeah, well, it's just not quite right for our audience." I said, "Okay, that's fine. I'm doing an interview with the New York Times this afternoon, and I want to be sure to spell your name right when I tell them that you won't play the film. So is your name spelled with a G or a D?" And I made that call to about 5 or 6 different exhibition circuits, and Longtime Companion played nationwide, did really great business, and got multiple Academy Award nominations, because it just shows you that this is, and I've had this experience many, many times with movies, where there's great specificity. Everybody can relate and appreciate and understand. Slumdog Millionaire, Juno, enormous number of films that seem like they're about something like this, right? But they're actually about this. And that was the case with Longtime Companion, and I haven't spoken about it in years, so I thank you for the question. Brothers McMullen came when I had left Goldwyn, and Peter Chernin at 20th Century Fox had given me the support to found a company called Fox Searchlight, which is still around. I think it's maybe in its 30th year. I think it's the best of all the indie sensibility companies, but I'm biased. And we had this idea, we had a great idea. I wrote up the business plan for it on 3 pages, get this, of a typewriter. No one in your audience knows what a typewriter is, but they could ask their parents. Well, we had this idea and we'd set up this Fox Searchlight, and I knew what we wanted to do, but we didn't have any movies in the beginning. And when you get a new company, what happens is a lot of people, suddenly everything starts coming in over the door. Usually everything that's been passed on by everybody alive. But a friend of a friend at a company, his name was actually Ed Burns, an old great New York cop, was a friend of someone at Fox, and gave me a VHS cassette and said, you really should look at this. My friend's son is trying to make a movie, and late on a Sunday night, I put a VHS tape of very early, unfinished work from Eddie Burns of the Brothers McMullen. And I looked at it thinking I would look at it for 2 or 3 minutes, and then I had done my job and I could nicely pass. And it was great. And it was what really makes independent films, and in many ways makes my entire philosophy about film. Because that film, when it ultimately went out, that was probably the least expensive film ever to come out in the major system in history. So I've worked on the least expensive, and I've worked on Avatar, the most expensive. And here's what I've learned. The audience, the folks out there on Letterboxd, they don't care how much a movie cost. They care how it makes them feel. Does it make them feel something? Something memorable, something significant, a feeling that they're not going to get outside of that movie theater? And watching that little video cassette of that movie, I realized, I felt, oh, I'd never seen this story. These were 3 Irish brothers. I'm a Jewish kid from Baltimore. I'd never seen this particular depiction of sibling life, and yet it was tremendously relatable. So I watched it the next day. Where's everybody? Eddie Burns was lugging cable for Entertainment Tonight to pay the rent. And it's happened to me a few times in life, maybe half a dozen times in a 30-year career. I got to make that phone call. Hi, Ed, you don't know me, but quit your job. I'm sending you a plane ticket. Your life's about to change. And we finished Brothers McMullen and got it in enough shape, put it in Sundance. It won the prize at Sundance, and both it and Eddie and Fox Searchlight were off to the races. So festivals are extremely important, and were for 20, 25 years or so as into the lifeblood of independent film. What's happening now in the last couple of years to traditionalists like myself, I find it not so great, because now what's happening is the festivals, which used to be a great proving ground for indie films that would go theatrical, are now really, they're really easy pickings for the streamers. And the streamers don't have P&L, and it doesn't matter to them what they pay. So if there's a really good film, streamers can always outbid an indie film company. And that is good and bad. You know, it's good for some young people and good for investors. Maybe not so good for the long run, because some of those movies appear on streaming services and they appear, and if the algorithm isn't in the right mood that day, they disappear. Make an indie film, then succeeds at the box office, and now you've impacted the culture. And impacting culture is the real mark of enduring cinema. And I'm very proud of my filmmaker relationships. And I think the mark, to be honest, of a good studio executive, as opposed to the people running Continental Pictures right now, is that you do repeat business, because that means that real artists trust you. And you mentioned some of them, but there are I've made multiple films with multiple, I think, really fine directors. Yes, I made, I believe, 6 films with Ang Lee. 28 Later was my 9th film with Danny Boyle. I made multiple films with the greatest directors who ever lived. Been fortunate and privileged enough to work on 4 films with Steven Spielberg and multiple films with Jim Cameron. So I think being able to do repeat business, that's probably the best sign of respect that creative people can have for someone on my side of the table, that they believe that you're there for them in hard times as well as good times. That's the key. It's easy when it's easy, but are you there for filmmakers, when it's hard? I believe that has a lot to do with my background, which is that I grew up in the indie world with I worked the first, certainly decade of my film life was working all with auteurs. So I come to understand that artistic mindset very well. I love all my children, but there are some movies where the risk involved, what they would call in the Olympics the degree of difficulty of the dive, was very, very high. I had the fortune to work on the two highest grossing movies of all time by the great master of our age, Jim Cameron. I worked on Titanic and Avatar, so of course. But interestingly, there are other failures of which I'm very proud, even though they failed, right? I'd love to recommend to your audience, they should take a look at The Crucible. It took Arthur Miller 40 years to get a movie of that made, with Winona Ryder and Daniel Day-Lewis, directed by the incredibly gifted Nick Heitner, with whom I had made The Madness of King George, another movie I recommend for your audience, which was a hit. And The Crucible was a failure, it was a bomb. But I can tell you, bomb or no bomb, it's maybe one of the finest American dramas that the business has ever made. That didn't help at the time, but it helps now. Now I feel really good about it. We weathered the loss and I feel really good about it and I'm really proud of it. So, if you do your job right, you can be sometimes proud of what seem like short-term losses as you are proud of big hits.
What excites you and what makes you nervous about the future of cinema?
I'm excited and enthused every day because there's a new possibility every day. Because I've come up with a lot of filmmakers, that are roughly in my generation, and worked with almost all of them. David and I were of similar age, Jim Cameron and Steven Spielberg, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's great, I enjoy that. But I love seeing the emergence of new voices, right? And it's really exciting when we get to work with the next generation, so to speak. Last night I went to a preview of a film called Big, Bold, Beautiful Journey, which I totally commend to your Letterboxd audience to go to the theater and see it because it's exquisite and you should see it on a big screen. But that's made by an emerging man who I think is extremely talented, named Coconata. In a few weeks, short period of time, we have a film from Darren Aronofsky called Caught Stealing with Austin Butler, and I made a number of movies with Darren over the years, Black Swan, The Wrestler, and I think enormously highly of them as an auteur talent, and this is maybe the most fun film he's ever made. So within just a few weeks, we have a film by an established master like Darren in Caught Stealing, and then just a few weeks later, a brand new voice in Coconut with Big, Bold, Beautiful Journey and Margot Robbie's first film since Barbie. So, and Colin Farrell's marvelous in it. So if you look at those things, that excites me. That's why I believe in the future. That's why when everybody tells me movies are dead, I tell them to go jump in a lake. I actually think Letterboxd is really, really important. I told you I was excited about, you asked me what was I concerned about. What I'm concerned about is the potential continuing lack of originality. What I refer to as the tyranny of IP. And those two films I mentioned to you, Big Bold and Caught Stealing, for example, pure original films, right? That used to be the lifeblood of what we did. Well, now there are fan communities that support IP, right? We're going to do fantastic with the new Spider-Verse movie because there's a huge fan community for that. But what really could help the business is a larger community that itself is interested in originality, that's trying to seek out and find new voices and then tell their friends about it, right? And that's, Letterboxd has come on like a house on fire, right? A couple of years ago, I'd never heard of you. Now in all our marketing meetings, I'm like, what's happening on Letterboxd? Because the vast majority of cultural impact now is socially driven, right? Traditional news sources have, gone the way of the dinosaur. People find out what's going on, what's of interest to them, what's culturally relevant socially. So to have a community like Letterboxd, its focus is on not just films, but this is my experience on the site, a willingness to take some risks and a willingness to embrace and champion some new voices. We need that. And that's why I think Letterboxd is a really great thing.